In the summer of 1805, a foreign army came within one shift of wind of doing what no invader had done in 700 years, landing on English soil and staying there. 200,000 French soldiers were minutes from taking London. A king was almost dragged out of his own capital in the dead of night, and the entire course of world history nearly bent in a direction it never actually took. Most people have never heard how close it really came. July morning. At Boulogne, 200,000 French soldiers had waited 2 full years inside wooden barracks, drilling through rain and heat for a single order that never seemed to come. Napoleon had stood on those cliffs more times than anyone could count. Staring across 21 miles of gray water at a coastline he could see but not touch, calling it nothing more than a ditch that courage alone would one day cross. He was so certain of victory that he had already struck a medal in advance. Frappé à Londres, struck in London, pressed into bronze before a single French boot had touched English ground. That morning, the Royal Navy, Britain's oldest pride and her only real wall, was somewhere else entirely, chasing a decoy fleet toward the Caribbean. The gap in the water stayed open just long enough. Ship after ship slipped free of the harbor. Young soldiers who had never seen England pressed against the rails, some praying, some weeping without knowing why, straining for their first glimpse of the white cliffs they had only heard about in songs. By the time anyone in London understood what was happening, French boots were already sinking into the wet sand of the Kent shoreline, and there was nothing left standing between them and the capital. Word reached London not as a formal report, but as rumor, passed street to street faster than any messenger could ride, until the entire city carried the same terrified whisper. They are here. It is happening. What followed was not the calm, organized defense that history books like to imagine, but raw, uncontrolled panic. Families who had lived in the same houses for generations packed what little they could carry in minutes, forced to choose between a grandmother's letters and a warm blanket. King George III was bundled into a carriage before sunrise, while his own advisors argued over where safety might still exist. Parliament, the beating heart of a nation built on order and law, dissolved into shouting matches by candlelight. Men who had spent their careers debating trade tariffs now forced to decide which cities could still be saved. The roads leading north out of London became rivers of people, mothers, old men, children, fleeing a city that had never once, in living memory, needed to be fled. Somewhere in that chaos, something far deeper than stone or timber was breaking too. The ancient story Britain had always told about herself, of an island the sea itself protected. A myth that had survived 1,000 years of continental war and died in a single morning. But an occupied capital is not a conquered country, and that difference would define everything that followed. While Napoleon's officers settled comfortably into requisitioned London townhouses, drinking wine from cellars that belonged to families now hiding or fled, the countryside beyond the city refused to lie still. Farmers in the hedgerows of Sussex who had spent their whole lives worrying about crop yields now spent their nights cutting French supply lines, vanishing back into their fields before dawn broke. Smugglers who had once run brandy and lace past customs officers turned those same hidden coves toward a far more dangerous cargo: muskets, gunpowder, and messages that could mean the difference between a French patrol finding its target or walking straight into an ambush. There was no single commander to this resistance, no war room issuing orders. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more dangerous. A magistrate who suddenly couldn't remember names when French officers came asking questions. A blacksmith who took twice as long as necessary to repair a wagon wheel. a grandmother who fed a fleeing soldier and never once mentioned it, not even to her own children. Napoleon had seen this exact pattern before, in Spain, in an uprising that would slowly bleed his empire for years. Britain now offered him the same poison in a different bottle, and it would cost him just as dearly. The consequences did not stay contained to the island at all. They rippled outward across the entire continent. Britain had never fought
We must
Napoleon with
reinforce
soldiers
the
alone.
southern front.
She had fought him with gold,
Vienna is exposed.
quietly funding coalition
The gold
after
must
coalition
reach
against
them by
France,
the 3rd.
keeping alive the
British
hope
funds are
of
gone.
resistance in
We stand
capitals
alone against
that would
Bonaparte.
otherwise have
Then we have
surrendered
no choice
years
but to
earlier.
accept their terms.
Overnight, that gold stopped flowing. Vienna and St. Petersburg, suddenly cut off from their paymaster, were forced into settlements far
The British
weaker than
Channel is
history had
close to
ever
us.
actually
We
recorded.
stand alone against
Inside Britain
Bonaparte.
itself,
Our forces
the
in
engines of the
Baltics
future
are
began to
exposed.
stall. The factories of Manchester,
output is lagging
which in the
behind the
real
mandated
world would
quota,
go on
monsieur.
to power
This is
an industrial
unacceptable. We are
revolution
doing our
that
best.
reshaped
The new
the
taxes make
entire planet,
modernisation impossible.
now operated
collapse
instead
of the
under French
continent
quota and
threatens our
French
commerce.
taxation.
Indeed,
Their
sir.
innovations
We must
quietly shipped
secure
across the
Atlantic
Channel.
Trade routes
And across the
immediately.
Atlantic, a young, fragile
cannot rely
United
on
States
British markets
watched
any
in a
longer.
particular kind of
Without their
dread,
protection, our
losing
commerce is
in a
vulnerable.
single
We must
stroke
look west,
both its
gentlemen,
greatest
the
trading
Ohio
partner
territory.
and its fiercest rival, forced to decide, completely alone, what kind of nation it would now have to become. Yet every empire built on conquest carries the seeds of its own unraveling, and this one would prove no exception. However triumphant it looked in that first year, every territory Napoleon had ever occupied eventually rose against him in some form. Spain bled him slowly. Russia would one day swallow an entire army whole in snow and silence. And Britain, proud and stubborn to her core, was never going to be different. Picture London's coffee houses, once alive with debate and argument, now either shuttered entirely or quietly
calls
watched
himself
by
Thomas
paid
B.
informants.
He speaks
Picture
ill of the
grandparents
occupation.
teaching grandchildren the old songs of liberty in secret, after dark, not as open rebellion, but as something gentler and far more patient. An ember kept glowing beneath the ash, waiting for the moment it might catch fire again. What looked, in that first year, like Napoleon's single greatest triumph, was slowly revealing itself as something else entirely. Not the end of the story, but the opening chapter of a far longer, far more exhausting war that would eventually cost him everything. History leaves us, in the end, with one question too heavy to answer comfortably and impossible to set aside once truly considered. Was the real Battle of Trafalgar not simply a naval victory, but the reason an entire chapter of tyranny was never written at all? In our actual history, Admiral Nelson's fleet shattered the combined French and Spanish navies before a single invasion ship ever crossed the Channel, and no occupation ever began. Nelson died in that battle without knowing the full weight of what he had just preserved. Not only ships and sailors, but an entire nation's sense of itself, and with it, the balance of an entire continent. In the world where the fog lifted and the French army landed unopposed instead, we glimpse a darker, more silent Europe, one without the single stubborn island, wealthy enough and defiant enough to keep funding resistance until an emperor finally fell. Sometimes
Trafalgar was not
battles
merely
that
a
never become
naval
legends
victory.
are
It
the
prevented
very
an
ones
invasion,
that quietly
preserved
saved
Britain's
everything.
independence,